Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chemel Gimel, and Mirtz Hashem today we will be learning Daf Kuf Nun Vav Amud Aleph. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Shabbos. We pick up today on the bottom line of Kuf Nun Hey Amud Beis Siman Shin Chav Dalid Sif Dalid. Our learning should be a schus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael Hanesunim Batzara Ubashivya Ha'imdim Bein Bayam Ubein Bayabasha Hamakim Yerachem Aleihem V'Yetziah Mitzara L'Rvacha Me'afela La'ira Mishibad L'Geula Hashta Bagala of Izman Kariv and Emar Amen. Our learning should be a schus for Shalema for Yeshua Levi ben Ahuva Malkachana, for Yitzchak ben Sian ben Dusha Rivka Bashir Aleach Havadasa Baserol. They should have a refuah Shalema Besaich Shar Chayil Yisrael. The limud of Klal Yisrael should be a schus. The Rebbe Hashem should watch over Gans Klal Yisrael. B'chol Makim Shehem. Okay, says the Mechaber Sif Dalid. We're continuing to learn the halachas here of what you can do to prepare food for animals. Now, the potential issue that we're going to be discussing in Sif Dalid, Sif Hey, Sif Vav, Sif Zayin, Sif Ches, for the most part, we're going to be discussing the potential issue of Tircha Yisera. There are various things that you want to do in order to prepare food for an animal. And the question is, what can you do? Because it's required tircha, it's necessary tircha. You have an achrayus to take care of and feed your animals. There's an issue of tzar balechayim. And what can you not do because it is considered extraneous? It's considered too much. It's inappropriate for Shabbos. It's tircha yisera. Now, along the way, we're going to come up against other potential issues of Yisurei Malacha, and we're going to have to explain why those are not issues. So against that backdrop, let's start Sif Dalid. Says the Mechaber, Kashin shel shibolim. You have straw that has been tied into bundles. And the Mechaber says the bundles that we're talking about, shekoishrim, they've been tied up Bishnayim oy bishloisha mekaimos. So imagine a bundle of stalks. Now, how do you fasten the bundle closed? So if it's a stalk of straw, they would take 2 pieces of straw or 3 pieces of straw, and they would use them to tie the bundle closed. In my mind, the picture that comes up right away is, think about what it looks like when you buy Hoshanas for Hoshana Rabbah on Sukkot. At least in the olden days, the bundles of Hoshanas were always tied with pieces of lulav, with little pieces from torn off of a lulav leaf. Nowadays, maybe they use rubber bands. But so over here, you have bundles of straw. They didn't take string. They didn't buy string and use string to tie the bundles closed. They took a piece of straw and they wrapped it around and they used straw to tie these bundles closed. And they would do it in 2 or 3 places. So if they were doing 2, they would put a band around the bottom of the bundle, a band around the top of the bundle. If they did 3, you would have 3 bands. 1 at the bottom, 1 at the top, 1 in the middle. Okay, so the Mechaber says, Kashin shel shibolim, these bundles of straw, shekoishrim, that are tied closed, bishnayim oy b'shloisha mekaimos, in 2 or 3 places. Now, the animal cannot eat the bundle. The animal's not going to eat a bundle of straw. The animal eats straw. You have to open up the bundle and you need to scatter the straw around so the animal can eat it. Are you allowed to open up the bundle? Is opening up the bundle considered tircha yisera? Says the Mechaber, no. Mutter lahatiran. You're allowed to untie. You're allowed to open up the bundles kedei shetoichal mehena behema, so that the behemoth should be able to eat the straw, because this is not considered to be a tircha yisera. Now, right away when you hear this halacha, if you've been paying attention to everything we've been learning in Chelik Gimel, you wonder right away, okay, is there an issue here of kosher umatir? Is there an issue of untying a knot? Not always are you allowed to untie a knot. So, says the Ramah right away, Haga v'yesh oimrim deloy shari lahatir rak b'kesher she'edel shel kayama. There are those that say that you're only allowed to open this up if it's not a kesher shel kayama. If it's a kesher shel kayama, you're going to come up against Isser Malacha. Now you have a shaila of matir, of untying. You're not allowed to untie a kesher shel kayama on Shabbos. But so long as it's not a kesher shel kayama, then the only issue that we're dealing with is an issue of tercha yisera. Says the Mechaber, tercha yisera is not a problem. You need to feed the animals. Now, the Mishnah Berurah is going to point out, but I just want to show you right away. The Ramah made his comment, and he said, V'yesh oimrim. There are those that say that it's not mutter to untie it only if it's a kesher she'eino shel kayama. Now that sounds like this is a matter of dispute. Yesh oimrim, you could only open it if it's not a kesher she'eino shel kayama. But it sounds like there are those that say, no, you could open it even if it's a kesher shel kayama. Now that begs a question. If it's a kesher shel kayama, you're coming up against the Isurei Daraisa. How are you going ahead and how are you opening this? We're not going to be matir to feed the animal. So how is this mutter? So let's take a look. Bearing that in mind, let's take a look at Mishnah Berurah's Cotton Yud Beis, where the Chavetz Chaim says V'yesh oimrim Kasab b'Teisefer Shabbos. The Sefer Teisefer Shabbos writes V'chein b'Sefer Beis Meir, and also the Beis Meir the Kulei Alma Svir Lehu Hachi. This Yesh oimrim is not a matter of dispute. Everybody agrees this is only mutter if it's a kesher she'eino shel kayama. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the Teisefer Shabbos to Beis Meir, they say nobody's matter this if it's a kesher shel kayama. The whole issue in the Mechaber is tirchi yisera, not kosher or matir. We're not being matir this if it's a kesher shel kayama. We're only being matir it if it's a kesher she'eino shel kayama. So why did the Ramah write Yesh oimrim? Says the Mishnah Berurah, Umipnei shaloi matza din zeh mefurish rak b'makam echad. When the Chavetz Chaim, when the Ramah researched this, he only found in one place where the statement was made that this heter is only when it's a kesher she'eino kayama. He didn't find anybody else say it. He found it in one source. Umipnei shaloi matza din zeh mefurish rak b'makam echad kasav yesh misha oimer. That's why he wrote it in the lashon of Yesh Oimrim. Even though the quote from the Mishnah Berurah is Yesh Mi Sha'omer, it's not what it says here. It says V'yesh Oimrim. Okay. Now, V'ayin b'chedusha Rabbi Akiva Eiger b'shem Harikash. But if you take a look at the chedusha Rabbi Akiva Eiger, he brings down from the Marikash the Daitoi that his opinion is the Harambam Cholik al Zeh. The Rabbi Akiva Eiger brings down this Marikash who says, no, there actually is somebody who disagrees with this Yesh Oimrim. The Rambam. He says that the Rambam holds that you would be allowed to open up these bundles even if the kesher is a kesher shel kayama. It still would be mutter. Now, why would that be? The answer is something that we learned earlier. We learned earlier when we were learning the halachas of kosher or matir, we learned in a Mishnah Berurah where the Mishnah Berurah said that there's no shaila of kosher umatir b'ma'achole behema. If you're dealing with something that is edible by animals, something that could be used for animal fodder, like straw, there is no issue of kesher umatir. Well, over here we're dealing with straw. These bundles were closed with straw. Straw is ma'achole behema. It's something that could be eaten by animals. So therefore the Rambam holds there's no issue of kosher umatir. Now, why does the Rambam hold that there's no issue of kosher or matir by ma'achole behema? We explained over there, the reason is because the Rambam reasoned ma'achole behema, when you have stuff that grows from the ground, like straw, that's ready to be eaten by an animal, that usually means that they're moist and soft. Says the Rambam, moist and soft straw, you might be able to make a knot in it, and it might hold for a short while. But what's going to happen when it dries up? When it dries up, it becomes brittle, and the knots open up, and I'll prove it to you. Take a look what happens by your lulav. When you make lulav rings, now it depends how you make the rings, but some people, myself included, I just take a relatively thin strip from a lulav leaf, and I mamish tie it with a bow. I tie it. It looks pretty. It holds when it's moist. As soon as it dries out, it falls apart. It doesn't hold a knot anymore. So the Rambam says there's no issue of kosher, of making knots And once there's no issue of kosher, there's no issue of matir by ma'achali behema, because ma'achali behema cannot hold a knot, and therefore the issue of kosher or matir is moot. So says the Maharikash. The Maharikash says that the Rambam would hold that you could open up the knots on these bundles of straw, even if they're, so to speak, a kesher shakayama. Now, what does it mean it's a kesher shakayama? It was tied with the intent that it should remain there. Doesn't matter, says the Rambam. It's machali behema. Machali behema, there's no din of kosher or matir. So the Maharikash says the Rambam would be chaylik on this Ramah. The Rambam would say, no, the heter to untie the bundles of straw is, even if it's, so to speak, a kesher shakayama, because it's ma'achol behema. Okay, continues the Mishnah Berurah, and he says, it become hakim, nevertheless, ledina ein lahakal. Halach lamaisa, you cannot be makel. The das Rashi v'haramach gam kein the yesh kosher u'matir af ba'achle behema. Ukemash kasafti le'el b'simin shin yod zayin sifhei b'bir halacha. Other Rishonim disagree with this Rambam, and they hold that there is an issue of kosher or matir, even by ma'achal behema. But Chai Adam Kosav, the Chai Adam writes, the Gama Rambam moide, the Bekash v'teven, yesh kosher or matir. Chai Adam says even the Rambam would agree with this Ramah. Even the Rambam would agree that there is an issue of kosher or matir by kash and teven, by straw and stubble. Why, says the Chai Adam? Because those are already dry. Animals eat them anyway, but they're already dry. And since they're already dry, if they're soft and pliable enough that you could make a knot, they will hold a knot, because they're not going to dry up any further than they already are, and they're not going to fall apart. Okay, now let's go weiter in the Shulchan Aruch, second line down. Says the Mechaber, so okay, you have these bundles of straw. The Mechaber said you're allowed to untie them and open them up so that the animals can eat them, and that is not Tircha Yisera. Aval, however, continues the Mechaber, also l'shafshef bahem biyadayim, you're not allowed to take the straw and roll it in your hands. Why would they do that? They would do that to soften it up for the animals. Aval also l'shafshef bahem biyadayim, you're not allowed to roll and rub them with your hands. Kederek she'oisim ba'achle behema, the way it is commonly done with animal fodder, kadesh yu noichim la'achlam, so that it should be soft and it should be easier for the animals to eat it. That you're not allowed to do. Why not? What's the difference? Deshivui oichel, and this is a very important klal, a rule. Deshivui oichel bedavar she'enoi oichel. To take something which is inedible the way it is, and to make it something that is edible, let's touch the words. Deshivui oichel, to make something edible, bedavar she'enoi oichel, when before it was not edible, mutter la'asosei oichel. That you're allowed to do. Any tircha that you need to do to take the animal food that in its current state is not edible by the animals. So, like the bundles of straw, the animals will not eat the straw bundled up the way it is. So you're allowed to untie it and open it up, because by doing so, you're making it edible. Therefore, it's not tircha yisera. Any tircha you need to do to change it from being inedible to edible is not a tircha yisera, and it's mutter. Ava mitrach ba'oichla b'davar shu royal achila. But to do additional tircha when something is already edible, loy tarchinan be'lach shiroy l'sakno yoiser. You're not allowed to do a tircha to improve it even more. So again, to untie the bundle, not a tircha yisera. The animal will not eat it the way it is. That's shivui oichel b'davar she'enoi oichel. That's mutter. But to roll it and rub it with your hands, to soften it up, to make it more geschmack for the animal, to make it easier for the animal to eat it, that's tircha yisera, because he could eat it the way it is, and therefore that would be aser. Says the Mishnah Berurah, ois katan yud gimel. La'asosei oichel, a tircha that's necessary to make it edible, that's mutter, mishum tzara de behema. Because you have an achrayus to the animal, there's an issue of tzar balachayim if it doesn't have what to eat. So tircha that you have to do to make the food edible, that you're allowed to do, but beyond that, you are not. Moving along to Sif Hey, 4 lines down in the Shulchan Aruch. Says the Mechaber. Eitzim, wood, shekitzatzan min ha'ilon, that was already cut off the tree before Shabbos. V'yesh b'achilam ha'yisrael behema ba'odem lachim. And there are those people that if you have fresh green wood, so you have tender branches that were cut off the tree from before Shabbos. Yesh machilim ha'yisam lebehema ba'odem lachim. There are some people who feed those tender branches or twigs to animals when they're still moist. Says the Mechaber, therefore, matirin, you're allowed to untie them if they've been bundled. Umifasfisin, what does that mean? Says the Ramah, loshin shifshuf, and these you can rub, bahem la'achilam, in order to feed them to the animals. Why? Because these are different than the bundles of straw. She'enam ru'uyim b'loy shifshuf. Because these tender branches, they need to be rubbed. The straw does not need to be rubbed. The animal can eat it the way it is. But these tender branches need to be rubbed in order for the animals to eat them. So even the rubbing would be mutter. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois katan yodalet she'enam ru'uyim, and therefore v'heve b'chalal shiva yoichla the mutter. So this would be included in the rule of doing tircha to make it edible, which is mutter. Sivav. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines down in the Mechaber, says the Mechaber Sivav. Mechatchin deluin lifnei behema. You're allowed to take gourds. Now, these are gourds that, the Mechaber is about to say, they were already harvested. They're already cut off the ground. Mechatchin deluin, you could chop up gourds, lifnei behema, in order to feed them to the animal. V'hu shenitlashu me'esmael. But it must be that they were already cut off the ground from before Shabbos. So first of all, obviously you're not allowed to cut it off the ground on Shabbos. That would be an issa d'oraisa of toilish. But more than that, let's say you didn't cut it off the ground before Shabbos, and you didn't cut it off the ground on Shabbos. They got detached from the ground on Shabbos some other way. A guy cut them off the ground on Shabbos without, you didn't ask him to. No mir lakum. He didn't do it for you, so there's no issue here. The guy, whatever, he came and he chopped it off the ground. So now you have gourds that are detached from the ground. Are you allowed to chop those up on Shabbos and give them to an animal? No, you're not. Why? Because they're muktzah. So again, let's analyze the halakha the Mechaber just said. If you have gourds that were detached from the ground before Shabbos, you're allowed to go ahead and chop them up, and you're allowed to give them to the animal to eat. But if they were not chopped off the ground, if they weren't cut off the ground before Shabbos, if when Shabbos started at Bein HaShmoshes, they were still attached to the ground, now you can't do anything with them on Shabbos. I don't care how they get detached from the ground. Why? Because they're muktzah. Why are they muktzah? They're muktzah because before Shabbos, you decided to leave them attached to the ground. Your decision, and it doesn't mean that you went outside and you made an active decision, hareini muchanim azumin, to leave these gourds attached to the ground. No, you didn't cut them off the ground before Shabbos. The fact that you did not cut them off the ground before Shabbos is considered dochinu biyadayim. You pushed them away akte daite from Shabbos. You separated your mind from them for Shabbos. You allowed them to remain attached to the ground on Shabbos. That's akin to making a decision that I'm not using them on Shabbos. So they were set aside. They were cast aside from Shabbos use. So they're no muktzah. So I don't care how they get detached from the ground. They're muktzah. They're also betiltel. So certainly you can't take them and chop them up and give them to an animal. Okay. Against that backdrop, let's see the Mishnah Berurah says the Mishnah Berurah is cut tezvav. Deluin, we're talking about gourds. Now, the Mechaber said you're allowed to chop them up. Well, why isn't that terchi yisera? Explains the Mishnah Berurah, v'dafka kishem koshim. We're talking about hard gourds. We're not talking about a zucchini. We're not talking about squash. We're talking about tough gourds. The animals can't eat them. She'enim ru'uyim lecha b'lo chituch. You need to chop them up for the animal to eat them. So, okay, it's not terchi yisera, and it's mutter. Aval kishem rakim, but if they're tender, heva b'chlam mitrach b'achol v'aser. Then to chop them up would be to improve them. That's terchi yisera, that would be awesome. Now the Mishnah Berurah makes a very important point. Va'afil kashim, even if they're hard gourds, and therefore we're saying that you're allowed to cut them up because it's not a terchi yisera, says the Mishnah Berurah, Afilu kashim lo yachtechem dak dak. You can't chop them up into small pieces. Mishum teichen. Because now you're going to come up against the Isser Malacha of teichen, grinding. Kedela b'simen shin chaf al sif yud beis le'inin chatichas yarok dak dak. Vayin sham oid. Now, Mishnah Berurah says a very interesting thing here. Vayin sham oid. Take a look over there in shin chaf aleph. The Isser tchina lo shayach raikim daitoy lahachilam la'achazman. We saw a Ramah in Shin Chaf Aleph. That high level compares the Isser of Teichen to the Isser of Berurah. And just like by Berurah, we have a halacha that when you want to do Berurah l'alter for immediate use, that's a mitigating factor in the Isser of Berurah. The Ramah said that l'alter is also a mitigating factor in the Isser of Teichen. That was the Ramah. Now, we saw the Mishnah Berurah over there. The Mishnah Berurah does not like this Ramah. He's not happy with this Ramah. He says, Harbe mefakvikim, Harbe achronim mefakvikim al zeh, and he includes the Beis Yosef. He says, many people disagree with this Ramah, and they hold that there is no heter of teichen because you're going to use it for immediate use. And we saw the halacha over there that even if you're cutting up vegetables and you're doing it for immediate use, we learned that really you should be makbid not to cut it into tiny pieces. You should leave it being somewhat large pieces. But over here, the Mishnah Berurah brings down this Ramah. He says, Ayin shamay disatchina, and he says it with a very strong language. Ayin shamay disatchina loy shayach raikim daitoy lahachilam lachazman. The Isser Teichen is only when it's for lachazman, when you're doing it for later use, not if you're doing it for immediate use. But whatever you're cutting up right now to feed to the animal in one shot right now, that wouldn't be considered tchina. It wouldn't be considered grinding. And the mashmois of this Mishnah Berurah is, go ahead. You want to cut up the diluin, you want to cut up the gourds into very small pieces in order to feed it to the animal right now? Go ahead. It's not teichen. We have the Ramah. It's not teichen. But in Shin Chav Aleph, the Mishnah Berurah didn't speak that language. So there is what could be said over here. I'm not going to go more into it right now. The Mechaber made the point that we have to be talking over here about diluting gourds that were detached from the ground from before Shabbos. Shenitlishu me'esmoil. Explains the Chavetz Chaim, like I spoke out. Di'ilu nitlishu hayom, because if they were picked on Shabbos, even if you didn't pick it, right? They got detached from the ground some other way. Asar afilu l'taltalon. They would be muktzah. They're also betiltal. L'kulei alma, misha muktzah. Now, there is a sharetzion that's kedai to look at over here. Well, all sharetzions are kedai to look at. But there's a sharetzion that's kedai for me to mention in the shir, Ois Katan Tesvav, where a few words in, the sharetzion says what I spoke out. The reason I'm mentioning it specifically is because we're going to see in the next sif, we're going to see a different case where the halacha is going to be opposite. Says the sharetzion, by the fact that you chose not to pick these gourds from before Shabbos, aktsinu, you cast them aside. You made them muksa. Udchinu biyadayim. That's considered that you were doiche them biyadayim. You pushed them away, and you were makta daitoimine. You separated your mind from them for Shabbos. Well, that is muktzah. You cast them aside for Shabbos use. So that's it. They're muktzah for the entirety of Shabbos. Even if somehow they fell off the ground on their own on Shabbos, they're still muktzah. They're also betiltal. Okay, moving along to Sif Zayin. Now, we're not going to talk about gourds. Now we're talking about a dead animal carcass. Now, a dead animal carcass back in the day, very valuable. That's meat that you could feed to your dogs. It's meat that you could feed to animals. Says the Mechaber, Mechatchin nevela lifnei haklavim. You're allowed to chop up an animal carcass in order to feed it to the dogs on Shabbos. Afilu nisnabla hayoim. Even if the animal died on Shabbos, right? So this is, remember what we just said in the previous if. The gourds have to have been picked off the tree before Shabbos. The dead animal, even if it died on Shabbos, right? It's not muktzah. You could go ahead, cut it up, and feed it to the animals on Shabbos. Maybe feed it to the dogs on Shabbos. And the Mechaber goes even weiter. Bein shahoisa misukenes. This is true whether the animal was sick and in danger before Shabbos. Bein shahoisa bria. Or even if the animal was perfectly healthy when Shabbos came in. So you had no hasaga, you had no dream that it was going to drop dead. That animal was walking, he was running around the corral with no problem. And then suddenly on Shabbos it had a major coronary and it dropped dead. It's still not muktzah. We'll have to see why. But let's go right to the Mechaber first. V'hani mili, when am I giving you this heter, says the Mechaber, that you're allowed to chop it up and give it to the klavim? B'nevela hakosha, where it's very, very tough meat. Now, it happens to be that there's a shtickle funny biur halacha over here. The biur halacha dibra maskel v'hani mili b'nevela hakosha. He says, "V'hecha mishkachasla." What is this case of like an exceptionally tough nevela that the animal's not going to be able to eat? Says the biur halacha, b'besar pile, elephant meat. He brings it down from a Gemara in Shabbos. Gemara in Shabbos says, what is this example of such tough meat that the animals can't eat it? The dogs can't eat it on Shabbos. And because the dogs can't eat it, it's not considered Terchi Yisera for you to cut it up. Let's talk about elephant meat. Interesting. How common was it to have elephant meat around? But whatever it is, that's what the biur halacha says. So again, what's the halacha that the Mechaber says here? You're allowed to cut up the nevela in order to feed it to the dogs. It's not Terchi Yisera. Why? V'hani mila b'nevela hakosha. That's if we're talking about exceptionally tough nevela meat. So the dog can't eat it unless you cut it up. Elephant meat. She efshar lehem lachla b'loi chaticha. Because they're not going to be able to eat it unless you cut it up. Avalam haisa ru'uya lehem b'loi chaticha. But if they're able to eat it without you cutting it up, loi, then it's also because it's Terchi Yisera. The mitrach b'mashu roi loi tachinan. Because you're not allowed to do tercha on something that's already edible the way it is. Let's see the Mishnah Berurah. Always cutting your zayin. The Mechaber said that the nevela is not muktzah. So even if the animal died on Shabbos and you had no expectation that it was going to die, it was perfectly healthy, still you're allowed to cut it up, the nevela, after it dies, and give it to the dogs. It's not muktzah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, first of all, Ubesefer El Yerabba B'stapek B'bria D'loi Hoysetaita Klal M'Ba'yom Shetamos V'yacham Yimena L'Klavim. The El Yerabba takes issue with this. The El Yerabba says the animal was perfectly healthy when Shabbos came in. Now you're telling me that if it drops dead on Shabbos, it's not muktzah? How could it not be a muktzah? The person didn't have a dream in a million years that this animal was going to be available for use on Shabbos to feed to animals. How is it not muktzah? The El Yerabba takes issue with this. The biur hagra also has a problem with this. Now, what's going on behind the scenes over here? So this is why I took the time to read to you Sharitzion Ois Katan Tesvav. You see, by the Deluin, what we explained is, by the gourds, we explained that if they get detached from the ground on Shabbos, they're muktzah. Why? Because the fact that you chose not to harvest them or cut them off the ground before Shabbos is considered dachinu biyadayim. It's considered that you actively cast them aside for Shabbos use, and therefore they remain muktzah for the entire Shabbos. It seems that the Mechaber wants to say that nevela is different. You have a cow that's perfectly healthy, and it's walking around the pen. On Shabbos, it drops dead. Now, you could make an argument that, well, Erev Shabbos, you chose not to shecht it. The same way by the Deluin, you chose on Erev Shabbos not to cut it off the ground, and therefore it's considered dachinu biyadayim. You might want to make an argument, and you might want to say that the cow, well, you could have shechted it on Erev Shabbos. If you would have shechted it on Erev Shabbos, you would have turned it into food. If it was food, it wouldn't be muktzah. But you declined to shecht it on Erev Shabbos. So maybe now it's dachinu biyadayim. The answer is no. Because to cut a gourd off the ground, all you need is a knife and 30 seconds. You take a knife, you go outside, you cut it off the ground. Shchita? Shchita is a much bigger deal. First of all, you have to be a sheikhet. Not everybody is a sheikhet. If you're not a sheikhet, you got to go get a sheikhet. Then, once you shecht this animal, you got malicha and everything else that's going on. So, you cannot say that declining to shecht an animal before Shabbos is considered techinu biyadayim. That's one thing. The other thing is that the Eliyah Rabbah, who says that it is muktzah, the Eliyah Rabbah doesn't say it's muktzah because you declined to shecht it. The Eliyah Rabbah says it's muktzah because we don't need to come on to techinu biyadayim in order for it to become muktzah. The Eliyah Rabbah says if a cow is perfectly healthy and walking around in a pen, so that you had absolutely no havamina that it was going to be available for Shabbos use, that automatically makes it muktzah, without the svara of the chinu biyadayim. The Mechaber said, when am I telling you that you're allowed to cut up the luin? That's hakosha. If we're that you're allowed to cut up a nevela, that's by a nevela that's kosher. That's when it's very hard. And therefore you're allowed to go through the tercha of cutting it up because you need to in order for the animal to eat it. So that's shivuye uchla. That's making it edible. That's not considered tercha yisera. Says the Mishnah Berurah, it doesn't have to be that we're dealing with elephant meat that's incredibly tough, and that's the only case where you're allowed to do it. I feel even if it's not mamish tough like elephant meat, so that the klavim technically could eat it if they're very hungry and they press themselves. Still, it's considered shavuya achla to cut it up. It's cutting your test. It's not terchi yisera because it's impossible for the animals to eat it without you cutting it up. Says the Mishnah, another case. It could even be that the meat is taka tender, and you're still allowed to cut it up because it's not terchi yisera. Why? Maybe we're talking about puppies. Puppies can't eat even tender meat unless you cut it up into bite-sized pieces. The chol nevela kasha lehem. Any nevela is inedible for puppies unless you cut it up. Ice cotton. We got to go weiter for this. Let's go into the Ramah at the end of Siv Zayin, 4 lines off the bottom. Okay, the Ramah brings up another question over here. We're talking about cutting up meat for animals. Okay, how about cutting meat into fine pieces in order to feed it to birds? Birds need very tiny pieces. Are you allowed to cut the nevela up into tiny pieces to give it to the birds? Well, cutting meat up into tiny pieces might be an issue of teichen. We learned earlier a machlokes. Is teichen only by gedulei karka? Are animals considered gedulei karka because they're nourished from the ground, and therefore teichen does apply to meat? We had an issue with this. So the Ramah is sending you back to Shin Chaf Aleph to see this discussion. Now says the Mishnah Berurah, Dak Akis Kat Chaf. You might wonder, why is there a shaila here? We just finished saying that if the animal can't eat it the way it is, you're allowed to cut it up because it's not terchi yisera. So says the Mishnah Berurah, why is the Ramah telling you look in Shin Chaf Aleph to see if you're allowed to cut up the nevela into tiny pieces for birds? I don't understand. The birds can't eat it unless you cut it up into tiny pieces. Explains the Mishnah Berurah, the potential problem is not a potential problem of terchi yisera. You're right. As far as terchi yisera is concerned, it wouldn't be terchi yisera to cut it up into tiny pieces for birds because the birds need you to cut it up into tiny pieces. That's not the issue. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the question is a teichen shaila. V'ayin b'bir halacha, take a look at the bir halacha, does that koydafka basar chai kosher? That this shaila is only negeya if we're talking about basar chai kosher, fresh, uncooked meat from a kosher animal. Avaloyal b'sar nevela. It's not negeya by b'sar nevela. Dezem mutar afilu dak dak. To cut up nevela meat, the bir halacha says there would be no shaila of teichen. Why would there be no shaila of teichen? There would be no shaila of teichen. Because nevela meat, the default use of nevela meat would be to serve it to dogs. Now, dogs don't need you to chop it up into tiny pieces. Birds do. Dogs don't. But when we see nevela meat, the default use of nevela meat is to feed it to dogs. Therefore, when you cut up nevela meat into tiny pieces, it's considered an insignificant act because it does not need to be cut up. It's true that you want to feed it to birds, and for the birds it does need to be cut up, but that's not the stam default use of nevela meat. The stam default use of nevela meat, dogs. Dogs don't need you to cut it up. Therefore, the act of cutting it up into tiny pieces is not considered a significant act of teichen, and it would be mutter. But the default use of basar chai kosher would not be for dogs. It would be for people. And by people meat, cutting it up into small pieces is considered significant, and that's why we would have a shiloh. Again, the Mishnah Berurah makes the point that this whole shiloh of teichen is only going to be negeya if you're cutting it up into tiny pieces to put it into storage to feed it to the birds later. But to cut it up into tiny pieces because you want to feed it to the birds now, again, he's referring back to the Ramah, who holds that la'alter is a mitigating factor in teichen. Finally, let's do Sivches. Says the Mechaber, Ein choitchen shachas. You're not allowed to cut up stubble. What's stubble? Says the Ramah Pirish, Yerik shel tfua sheniktzar terem shenispash lahatvua. These are the stalks of grain that you cut down when they're immature. The grain has not yet ripened. You're cutting it down when it's immature. You're not allowed to chop this up for animals on Shabbos. V'charuvin or caribs lifnei habehema. So you're not allowed to. So let's just read the Mechaber without the Ramah. Ein choitchen shachas v'charuvin lifnei habehema. You're not allowed to chop up immature stubble or caribs to feed them to an animal. Bein daka, bein gasa, whether you're cutting it fine or you're cutting it coarse. Again, the issue over here is terchi yisera. The Mechaber is telling you to cut up immature stalks. You don't need, the animals can eat it the way it is. So to cut it up would be terchi yisera. To cut up caribs, that would be terchi yisera. They can eat it the way it is. Says the Mishnah Berurah, even if you're cutting it large so that there's no issue of teichen. The issue here is a terchi yisera shayla. Obviously, we're talking about tender caribs. But by hard caribs, the type that they always gave out for some inexplicable reason on Tu B'Shvat when we were in school as kids. Tu B'Shvat, they would give you these bags of dried fruit to celebrate Tu B'Shvat. There was always a piece of carob in there, and I never understood why anybody would put this in a bag to give it to anybody. It was completely inedible. It was like wood. It was like chewing on a 1x2. No, I can't understand what anybody was thinking. Oh, like anybody would have spent a penny on it. The only use I could see for it was burning it. It was inedible. So b'cheruvit kashim she'enim ru'uyim bilti chituch, by the hard caribs that cannot be eaten even by animals unless you cut them up, mutter would be mutter to b'chlal shiva yochlehu. V'chol zeh b'chatichis g'dolos k'tzas. This whole discussion is only if you're cutting it into somewhat large pieces. Avadakos, but to cut it into fine pieces, also mishum chashash tchina and mechatich la'achilam la'chazman. Okay, we're going to stop over here. We'll continue next time with Siftes. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. Listen to limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Baruch Hashem should send Yeshua Sefros Parnas and Shidduchim to all those in need. We should be zeicher to see the Bias Gael Tzedek. B'mher v'yameinu. Amen. Be well.